Good morning. I'm Sidney Porter from the Health Physics Society History Committee, and it's my distinct pleasure to be interviewing one of the few charter members of the Health Physics Society, gentleman Roy Parker, a PhD physicist who has contributed a great deal to health physics over a long and very distinguished career. Roy, you want to tell us about what your beginnings were and how you started into this unusual profession?
Sure, Sid. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi. Went through public schools there. Also went to college at a little small college in Jackson called Millsaps. Graduated from Millsaps in chemistry, and I was looking around to find assistantships in chemistry when I noticed a brochure on a bulletin board for the Atomic Energy Commission's fellowship program, what was called in those days radiological physics. So I applied for it, was lucky enough to get it, and that led me to Vanderbilt under the AEC fellowship program. And I eventually got my master's from Vanderbilt.
Now, who were some of your fellow students then when you were in class back then?
Not sure I can remember some of my fellow students, but I think the main things that I remember about the program back in those days, of course, was the three instructors that we had principally from Oak Ridge National Laboratory that would come over on a weekly basis, and those instructors were Alda Anderson and KZ Morgan and Myron Fair.
Three very famous people in our profession, of course.
That is correct.
And so you went into the fellowship program, and then you had a summer at Oak Ridge.
Had a summer of internship at Oak Ridge, which was probably most valuable because that gave a lot of hands-on experience.
And was Johnny Auxier then? Was he?
That was before the days of John.
That was before John's days. Okay.
Before John's days.
So it was KZ. Do you remember anybody else there? And that's a long time ago.
Oh, I can remember some faces, and I can't think of the names.
But in any case, you went through the fellowship program, and then at that point, what did you decide to do?
I wanted to continue in my educational career and get my doctorate. I was getting my master's, doing my thesis work at Vanderbilt when my major professor accepted a position as head of the physics department at Michigan State. He arranged for me for an assistantship at Louisiana State University in beta spectroscopy. And so I went down to Louisiana State University at the time, having done my research but have not completed writing my thesis. And finally in 1960, finally wrote my thesis and got my master's from Vanderbilt. At that time, I was still a graduate student at LSU.
Now, were you still working in beta spectroscopy?
It was still a research area, was still beta spectroscopy.
Because I don't know whether you're familiar or not, but you know the first beta spectroscopy transport equations were all done on a secret document by Herb Parker in the late 40s.
Yes.
And I don't know whether that information was available to you at that point or not. I don't think it was.
It was not.
Sadly.
It was not. I subsequently met Herb and some other things that will come up later.
But so anyway, so you're working on your master's and your PhD, and you're actually working though in health physics too. You want to tell us about that a little bit?
Not so working, but volunteer, I guess. The faculty at LSU found out that I had a background in health physics, so I was drawn into the Radiation Safety Committee meetings as a graduate student, as a resource to them. Started out attending some of they was invited, and they had me give opinions on various projects which they were trying to approve or how this should be handled from a radiation protection viewpoint.
I see, and so you were an advisor to the Radiation Safety Committee then.
That's probably a good term, yes.
And what can you remember? What were the projects that were your biggest challenges? Do you remember what you were working on back then?
One of them was that they wanted to tag fish in order to be able to subsequently trace them. and it was a big controversy as to how large the sources should be, or should these fish be tagged at all, and that was somewhat interesting.
You know, I guess it was probably not well known then that fish are pretty radio resistant compared to mammals. I'm not sure that was known back then.
That did not come up to my knowledge.
So you worked hard and got your PhD in nuclear physics. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then at that point, you stayed at LSU for a while?
They asked me to become the radiation safety officer for the Louisiana State University system, and I was also asked to become the administrator for the physics department and hold faculty positions in both the Nuclear Science Center and the physics department. And so I asked them to make the decision as to where they wanted me. They could not make a decision, so they split me. That was nice. I had 2 offices and nobody could ever find me.
There's nothing wrong with that. And so you stayed there for what, a few years?
About a year or so, and then the Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana called me into his office one year and asked me to become the director of the radiation control program for Louisiana. I turned him down. About a year later, he called me back in again and asked me to become the director of the radiation control program for Louisiana. And I never will forget it. Said he, fine gentleman, Lieutenant Governor, he looked at me across his desk in the state capitol there in Baton Rouge. And he says, son, he says, why won't you accept this position? And so I looked at him. I don't know if I really had the courage enough to do it, but I did it. And I says, Governor, I says, I'm scared of Louisiana politics. And so he looked at me and he says, I'm scared of radiation. He says, if you will become director, he says, I will guarantee you and give you my assurance that as long as I have anything to do with government in Louisiana, he says, you will never receive any political interference. I thought that was a good deal. I took him up on his offer, and he held true to his word. The whole time that I was director, I never received one bit of political interference.
Well, that was really the technical beginnings of the Louisiana State Radiation Protection Program, wasn't it?
This was an independent agency. They wanted to set it up as a separate agency aside from the other agencies.
So you set the program up, essentially.
I was given the keys to an office with nothing but blank desk.
Well, that's what I call starting from the beginning.
Yes.
And so this program, of course, is well known today and has been for many, many years. And you were with that program for about 6 years, did you tell me?
About 7.
About 7 years. And then at that point, you decided that you needed new challenges, as I remember.
I didn't decide. The physicians in Baton Rouge approached me, and they were setting up a nonprofit, freestanding radiation treatment facility for cancer. And so they asked me to become the administrator and the medical physicist at this new facility. So I accepted.
And that's quite a challenge, of course, and quite a change from what you were doing before.
It was a change from health physics to medical physics. We also had nuclear medicine, and so one of my jobs, of course, as a medical physicist was maintaining the therapy equipment, calibrating it, and also planning the treatments that the oncologist would prescribe.
Well, that's a huge change in job description, to say the least.
Yes.
Quite a challenge. And so you stayed with that job for, what, some 3 or 4 years?
That's correct. And the reason that I left, I will be somewhat blunt about it, is simply because I don't guess I am compatible with working with physicians.
I think there are a lot of people understand that phenomena.
I sought a position with a colleague of mine that had a company in Baton Rouge called Gamma Industries. It was a large company that specialized at that time in seal sources, principally industrial radiography sources, eventually into well logging sources, well logging tracers. We also had a teletherapy. We also manufactured teletherapy sources out of a hot cell up in New Jersey. And so I became the manager of the teletherapy program and performed teletherapy source exchanges throughout the world, service teletherapy equipment, in addition to being the radiation safety officer and part of the management at Gamma Industries.
Well, that certainly was a challenging job. Now, during this time, it seems to me that you had a lot to do with founding the Deep South chapter, didn't you?
Actually, I founded the Deep South chapter back when I was with the state.
Oh, it was that far back.
It was that far back. That was founded, I believe, in 1950s. Must have been maybe either 56 or 57. Excuse me, 66 or 67.
And wasn't CRCPD founded around then?
No, actually, Jim Terrell, who was the director, I guess, of the radiological health programs for then the Public Health Service.
The old Bureau of Rad Health.
Old Bureau of Rad Health.
He had
a organization which he called the Conference of Radiological Health, which was actually sort of the four founders of the four group of the CRCPD, and I was president of that Conference of Radiological Health for 1 year. And after we became an agreement state, just as I left, I was elected director of the agreement state group.
Now you were one of the earliest agreement states, as I remember.
It was an early one. I forget which number we were, but we were down. Maybe numbers, I don't know. 17 sounds right, but I'm not sure that's right. It also, while I was the director of the radiation control program, I was appointed by Secretary of Health Elliot Richardson at the time, and to the first, it's got a long name, Technical Electronic Products Radiation Safety Standards Committee, which people call it TEPRASEC for some reason.
I remember TEPRASEC.
And this was the first one, and our first problems were dealing with the color television, the microwave ovens, and the diagnostic X-ray standards.
So you had lots of challenges then. That's for sure. Now, you went to Gamma Industries in about '74, as I remember.
That is correct.
And you were doing a whole wide variety of things there, and so you were actually using your health physics and your medical physics.
That is correct.
And what would you say your biggest challenges were then, Roy?
While at Gamma Industries? The biggest challenge was actually Gamma Industries had unfortunately bought a company in Houston, Texas. And after they had bought it before I came with Gamma Industries. So when I went over there and found out that the previous company had misread and regulations and everything else. What we found out was they had interpreted the regulations for disposal of radioactive material in sanitary sewer systems that were prevalent at the time, and they considered they didn't think about the fact that they did not have a sanitary sewer system, but a
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
but had a septic tank type of system.
Uh-oh.
And that was the biggest challenge.
Sounds like quite a challenge. When you all bought that, I hope you bought it with a hold harmless clause in there.
I don't know how they bought it, but they suffered from it, I think, the whole time.
So, well, if they suffered from it, then they probably didn't.
They didn't.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that made that same mistake. But anyway, so you not only had to do teletherapy was a lot of work too. Changing out those sources, but you had to take care of past sins of this other company. Is what it sounds like. And so you were with them for some 4 years or so, as I remember.
That is correct.
And so what it gave you is academic background, and now on top of that, you were in the
Had a
brutal world of government background, and then the brutal world of physics medical background. So what did you do with all of these disciplines that you were able to master and work
Well,
in?
I had always wanted to be on my own. So in 1978, my wife and I made an agreement that I would give it a try as an independent for 1 year. And that if at the end of 1 year that if we were hungry, I would go out and get a real job. And that was in 1978, 25 years ago. Haven't looked back yet.
That's wonderful. And so tell me about your biggest challenges as an independent consultant now. What are the things that you remember?
Well, my principal client from the very beginning that a lot of people find unusual is Federal Express. And I had not planned on getting into necessarily the transportation part of this, but because of my principal client being there, I've gotten into transportation. And what I have found is that I'm in an area that is somewhat aside from the mainstream of the health physicist, and it's also one of these areas that people know that it's there, but when you're dealing with the transportation of radioactive material, it's something that most health physicists think that's done, by somebody else in some other way. And so it's been interesting in order to work with Federal Express. I do training for them internally. I give commercial programs for them on transportation of radioactive material. They have a exemption, and the exemption is somewhat like a license from the NRC, but it permits them to transport on aircraft more than 50 TI, transport index, and without regard to separation distance requirements. And what you do is you substitute a health physics program in terms of actually surveying aircraft and putting in a monitoring program for the people that are handling that amount of material without relying upon the separation distances that's normally used in the transportation industry. And it's public record that Federal Express will, strangely enough, will put on as much as 1,000 TI on one aircraft. And the radiation levels around that 1,000 transport index, I cannot see with an ordinary survey meter on the flight deck detect. I can see it around the outside of the aircraft to some extent, but not on the flight deck.
Well, that's the important thing, isn't it? That there's no significant exposure to the flight crew.
That is correct.
Now, I guess you got involved very early in the international rules for transportation too, then, didn't you?
To the extent that my clients have been involved in the international area, and of course the transportation regulations are actually derived from the IAEA groups.
And getting closer all the time.
And getting closer all the time, that is correct.
And so do you, someday, hopefully we'll just have one set of transportation regs for the world.
Well, we actually have been pretty close. We're always in the U.S. seems to be always in a catch-up period. And for the past several years, up until last year, the U.S. regulations and the international regulations were virtually identical for the first time in years. But again, whereas last July 1 of 2002, most of the rest of the world went to the so-called 1996 IAEA transportation standards. And it's probably going to be another year or two before the U.S. gets there. So a shipper, one of the problems is that a shipper of radioactive material internationally may have to do things a little bit differently than he does for a domestic shipment.
But you see that all eventually resolving itself?
Well, it actually was resolved for a period of time. The U.S. was on the 1985, strangely enough, IAEA standards, until 1996. In 96, they finally bought into the 1973 standards in 1996. They finally bought into the 1985 standards in 96. So until 96, until last year, things were about the same. But now we're behind again.
Well, Roy, tell me, where do you see the profession of health physics going now? If you could sort of uncover your crystal ball a little bit, what do you see as the future? Do you have any words for new people that are just entering the profession now?
I think at one time I would have drawn a dark picture simply because the usages of radiation seem to be decreasing. This day and time, there always seems to be something coming up, such as our homeland security issues that we're discussing here at this meeting in San Antonio, that throws a new light on the necessity for radiation protection professionals.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. Each time we think that things are really starting to slow down, something else seems to happen. Well, I think that it's kind of amazing that, since those early days in '55 when you got your bachelor's in chemistry, you've, as a charter member, you've been in a number of professions, health physics really just being one of them. And it's kind of surprising that you kind of go away a little bit and then come back in again. But you certainly have been a contributor, and I think that there's a lot for you to be proud of in the things that you have contributed to this and the medical physics profession. And the Health Physics History Committee thanks you very much for spending some time and telling us about your very illustrious career.
Thank you very much, Sid.
I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it also.